This video is about language acquisition, what we're doing right now, what you're doing right now. Listening to this video, listening to me speak in English, you're learning, you're acquiring English. You're acquiring it through comprehensible input. My voice, me saying things in the language that you're learning in English, is the input to you, and I hope that it's understandable, very understandable for you. But I want to talk about language teaching, second language teaching, the teaching of foreign languages, of second languages. Right now, you are learning a second or third language, a foreign language, English. English isn't your mother language. It's not your native language. The problem with most second language teaching, the problem is that it's teaching. There's a formal activity called teaching. But to learn our native languages, as babies, as kids, no one teaches us. We hear lots of the language being spoken. We understand lots of the language. And after several years, we have acquired the language. We can speak it. At school, we're taught literacy. Literacy means reading and writing. A person who is literate can read a book, can read written text, and they can write. An illiterate person can't read and write. So for our mother language, we're taught literacy. Other people teach us to be literate. They teach us to read and to write after we've acquired the language, after we've acquired the ability to speak and understand the core of the language, the everyday spoken language. But in second language teaching, it's flipped around. It's done in reverse, in a different order. First, you're taught to be literate. You're taught to read and write in the language. You're taught literacy before you even know the language, before you've acquired, before you've learned the actual language. It's the wrong way around. It's the reverse of how we learn our mother languages, our native languages. It's strange because in everything I've heard about second language teaching, I've never heard someone say the word literacy. For kids in school learning their first language, it's obvious. Everybody understands the difference between language itself, and literacy. They're different things. Literacy isn't a language. There's a literate language, a written language, in the sense that there's a much larger vocabulary that is mainly used in written texts. There are many words that you'll only ever read or write. You'll very rarely speak them or hear someone else speaking them. You'll very rarely use them in speech. You won't say them yourself or hear other people saying them. That is the written language. It is a language in the sense that it's a collection of words, a vocabulary, as well as phrases and more refined, more detailed and specialized grammatical rules, very specialized sentence structures, for example. But it still rests, it still goes on top of the actual language that we learn as children. But this simple difference between literacy and language is lost in second language teaching. In all the classes I've done learning other languages, and all the people I've heard talking about teaching a second language, or the things I've read about it, I've never seen or heard the word literacy, which I find a bit strange, because why should it be different for a second language? I think a second language is the same as your first language. You acquire the language, and then afterwards you can become literate in that language. You can learn to read and write in that language. But it's taught normally the other way around. The problem isn't teaching people to read and write itself, because, for example, learning to read is very similar to acquiring your first language. You learn to read by reading. Maybe there's a few techniques to do with the letters that make up words, learning which sounds match which letters to help you decode, to understand the words a bit better. But really, the only way you learn to read fluently, to read fast, to read quickly, is to read lots. You acquire reading like you acquire your native language. And you acquire writing in the same way you acquire speech. Your comprehension reaches a very high point, and from then on, you can speak, you can write. There's a bit of effort to learn how to move your mouth to make the sounds, in the same way there's a bit of effort to learn how to move your hand to write, but that's a little bit of effort at the end. It's impossible that you can write something that you couldn't already understand if you saw it written by someone else. You have to understand everything, and then you can write it. Forcing literacy in second language learning, second language teaching, isn't actually the problem. It's learning rules that's the problem. Normally grammar rules. To acquire your native language, no one told you any rules. You acquired the language and you know how to speak it. But when we learn to read and write, because it's at school, it's often mixed with the learning of formal grammar rules. We learn what a proper sentence is like. We learn the rules that make something correct versus incorrect. But it's separate, because you could learn to read and write without knowing any of those rules. So the use of conscious rules, making people practice speaking, practice writing, using conscious rules, is a problem in literacy as well as in second language teaching. But it's worse in second language teaching because it's from the very start. When you're learning to read and write, you already have acquired the language itself. The language has developed. It's developed through acquisition. But if you're learning a language from scratch with rules, practicing conscious rules of grammar, not just of grammar like sentence structure, but of pronunciation rules, for example, that there's a thing called a letter, A, B, C, D, and there's things called sounds, and each letter has a sound. But this has nothing to do with actual language. When we speak, there's a huge amount of different sounds, of different variations of sound, of changes that happen when two particular sounds are spoken together. That's different for two other sounds. It's a lot more complicated and has nothing to do with this simplistic connection of a letter with one or two sounds. And that's the problem with second language teaching, because when you're learning to read and write, you already know how to speak the language. You already have acquired all the sounds, the sound system in your mind that you need to speak the language properly. And the rules that you learn in reading and writing, connecting letters and sounds, can't damage that sound system that you have already acquired. But in learning a second language, if you're learning with these rules, you're learning these made up things, these made up sounds, and you're going to be practicing speaking those sounds that have nothing to do with the actual language. So you'll end up speaking the language with a system that doesn't resemble, it's not the same as the system that an actual language resembles in our minds. You're going to have these conscious links that have been developed through a lot of effort, through a lot of force, between letters in a spelled out word and sounds. And for example, you're not going to have the capacity to combine those sounds very nicely, to speak very fast, so that they all flow together, because you've learned them as separate, discrete sounds. And speaking the language is going to be a lot of effort, is going to be difficult, is going to require effort, because you learned it through effort. Whereas if you learn the sounds through listening, through comprehension, by acquiring the language without any conscious rules, you'll end up with, over time, a sound system in your head that knows how to say any word in the language, that knows how to say it slowly, knows how to say it very quickly with a lot of speed, and how it sounds slowly, for example, and how it sounds when you're speaking fast can be very different. And all the levels in between, all the differences of speed, can all have different sounds, different ways of speaking. And that complexity, that richness, can only be produced by a rich sound system that you've acquired through listening to comprehensible input in the second language. What do you think? Do you agree with what I've said in this video, or do you disagree? Tell me in the comments below. All right, see ya. And don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. The link is in the description below.